Welcome to One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. With me today is Andrew Goldberg, Emmy Award-winning director and filmmaker and creator of the new PBS documentary, Viral, Anti-Semitism in Four Mutations. The film covers contemporary anti-Semitism by examining forces such as the far right in the US, the far left in the UK, Islamic Radicalism in France, and anti-Semitism in Hungary. Filmed over 3 years, Goldberg and his team were one of the only producers allowed to film in the Tree of Life synagogue after the shootings in Pittsburgh. Goldberg has previously executive produced and directed 13 primetime documentary specials, numerous short-form segments, and films. Now, our conversation today will focus on Goldberg's decision to produce a documentary on anti-Semitism at this critical point in history, his experiences making the film, and why he chose to highlight specific subjects like the Tree of Life synagogue shooting and the locations that account for each of the four mutations. I'll also ask Goldberg about his key takeaways and what he hopes viewers will take away from the film going forward. Andrew, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much.
So anti-Semitism is an age-old issue, the oldest form of hatred. Why did you decide, this is 3 years ago, it seems now we're at a critical mass in terms of the spike in anti-Semitism. What did you find was particularly appealing, or what drew you to it at the moment that you decided, I'm going to do a documentary about anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that during the Obama administration, we saw a racism finding a voice, racism in general, bigotry, finding a voice that it had not crystallized the way it in years prior. When I say in years prior, I mean 5 or 10 years prior. I don't mean the 1950s when things were much worse. And I think that the right, the elements of the far right and people on the right, and I don't want to broad brushstroke them by any means, but enough vocal voices were very unhappy with a black president. As the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates has said, that the election of Donald Trump represented in many ways a backlash to Obama. And I think that there was a lot of anger that built up around this, a sort of inherent racism. And, with that come all the bigotries. And anti-Semitism is always the kind of, the avant-garde of this point. There's always, it's always like, there's that old, sentence, first they came for the Catholics, then they came for the labor. I don't even remember the exact quotes, but it should more be like, first they came for the Jews, because anti-Semitism is like the first blip to hit when, bigotries and racism start coming to the fore. You see your biggest jumps in anti-Semitism right away. And shortly after the election of Donald Trump, we saw a lot of indicators. There were some bomb threats. Of course, those turned out to not really be Trump related, but we saw some, I don't want to say Trump related, post-election related. We saw some indicators. There were tombstones that were being toppled. There were more and more web activity, and alarm bells started to ring. I think it's very dangerous to place this at the foot of Donald Trump. I don't think that he is the cause of what happened shortly after the election by any means. But I think it is reflective of a community of people that felt they didn't have a voice under Obama. And now they had a voice. They had no pushback from leaders when they would express anti-Semitic views and ideas at the federal level. And I saw this ramping up, like a car going right onto a highway. And I immediately thought we need to make a film about this. And PBS, shared that, I don't know if vision is the word, but they saw what we saw, and they were with us, very interested in this from the beginning.
So that's the far right. You've got 3 other mutations. How did you choose those 3? I mean, there are so many different. We've seen incidents of violence in Europe, in particular. Why those 3 additional?
Look, I mean, we wanted to show anti-Semitism, period. Now, how do you do that? I mean, anti-Semitism exists in every corner of the world, and it exists in a different flavor, form, expression, mutation in every single different place. And you have sort of 4 neat boxes that people can digest. I mean, when you try and educate an audience on an issue, it's very hard to sort of take on an issue It's sort of hard to just say anti-Semitism is this thing and it's everywhere without then getting into the examples. And you need to get into the examples. So we liked the far right in the US, and people kept saying, what about the far left in the US? And we thought about the far left in the US, but I felt like that didn't show people the urgency of the problem the way England did. The far left in England is extremely, or was extremely anti-Semitic. And I think that it gets very distracting to point out what's happening in the beginning of a trend in the United States when you can see what's in full bloom in England. So we had the far right in the United States, the far left. We chose England because of its extreme expression. We wanted to show from the government, and no one had been, government is, basically what led to the Third Reich, top-down anti-Semitism. And we wanted to show that, and there was no better place for that than Hungary, where we saw top-down anti-Semitism. So we have the political right, the political left, coming down from the government, and then we wanted to show it coming up from communities on the ground, so to speak. And there was no better example of that than the people of Muslim origin, some, not many, but some who've been bad actors in France. And those were our sort of 4 touch points. There are, I mean, the film is called Anti-Semitism in 4 Mutations. It could have been called in 400 Mutations, because it's always different in every different place. But those 4 corners, more or less, cover most anti-Semitism. Kind of falls into one of those categories, sort of.
Can you discuss the relevance of the film now? You did this 3 years ago, but now with the COVID-19 crisis, which has fueled a wave worldwide of conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, you couldn't have foreseen this when you started the project, but how do you see the relevance now, given what's happening around us?
Well, I didn't choose the name viral. The name of the film is, of course, viral because it behaves like a virus. A producer that works with me did. The point simply being that anti-Semitism spreads, right? Viruses spread, and it spreads from person to person. And then, of course, when something on the internet goes viral, it spreads all over the place. And the internet is where a lot of anti-Semitism is now. And so viral was a kind of a catch-all term. We came up with the title about, I want to say, a year and a half ago. We certainly had no indication that COVID-19 would be happening. And in fact, COVID-19 shut down our theatrical release because people just weren't going to movie theaters. I mean, in Pittsburgh, I think 4 people went to the theater because this was in full bloom by the time, this happened. And so we just finally ended our entire theatrical run.
I mean, here we have a crisis, we have a health crisis, public health crisis. And yet there are still those, for example, the leadership in Iran and others on the anti-Semitic web who have sought to blame Jews. It's classic. It goes back to the Middle Ages with the Black Plague.
Yeah.
That to blame Jews for this terrible public health crisis that we're experiencing. And I know, I mean, the film was already done. So it isn't as if we could always be putting new things into a film. I guess you can always be putting them in. But it's interesting that, just as this has, appeared on PBS, that we have even a new strain. This was a strain that we, 4 months ago, we didn't see coming, but it came about as a result of this public health crisis.
I can speak to that. I mean, I think that, anytime there's an ill in society, it's a reflexive action that it must be the Jews. That's a very interesting thing, okay, is that, why would the Jews be seen as capable enough to pull this off? The idea that Jews are behind the scenes, pulling strings, making things happen, influencing the world powers. The notion that a man like George Soros could be, many people believe George Soros is flipping governments, causing revolutions, controlling. Some people believe that a wealthy Jewish banking family controls the weather. There's this idea that Jews have this unbelievable power, right? This unbelievable power that they must get because they're very clever. They work behind the scenes. This perception of cleverness is the same reason people think that Jews might be good lawyers or doctors. So while someone says a Jewish lawyer or a doctor is good at what they do because they believe Jews are smart and capable, it's the same idea that leads to them believing that Jews are able to cause all these problems in society, which is why Jews are blamed for the Black Plague, right? Jews are blamed for any social ill in society, and now they're calling it the Jew flu. COVID-19 is the Jew flu. It's put together by the Chinese and Israel. The Zionists and Israel have put together this virus to control the Western powers, to weaken the Western powers so that the Zionists and the Jews can once again return to some some place of power they've never had, but that the conspiracy theorists believe. On the flip side, those who may not share that idea believe that the virus is a good way to hurt Jews. So there was a series of internet posts that said, if you get coronavirus, go to an area where there are Jews and cough on them. So we have this you could drop anything into the room and they go to it like shark bait. It makes no difference what it is. People like, I was saying to someone, if you want to go fishing for bluefish, which is a fish here, they said they'll eat anything. It's the same thing with an anti-Semite. You throw a problem into the room, blame a Jew. It's a reflexive action. It isn't even thought through. There's no logic to it. Why else would they say? Someone wrote an article that the Rothschilds have $900 trillion, which is more than the entire gross domestic product of the planet, of every country in history. But yet there's this belief that somehow we're capable of all these things.
So let me ask you, let me stop you there, because the internet is has been the force multiplier here. The question, in Europe, for example, where there are not the constraints, and we have First Amendment here, but in Europe, when they have discussions about the internet and what can go out on the internet, there are hate laws, anti-hate laws on the books in a number of countries in Europe, even though we have big problems with anti-Semitism in Europe. But you can legislate speech. You can legislate hate speech. We can't do that here because of our constitutional freedoms, as it were, much as we would like to do it. So my question to you is, because the internet goes to places that has laws and that doesn't have laws against hate speech, how do we deal with the internet? How would you deal with it? I'm sure you follow this, I'm sure, right, all the time because of the work that you've done.
Listen, I'm a big free speech warrior, but there's a line. So where does free speech begin? Where does free speech end? As a journalist, I'm a big warrior for free speech. The internet, however, is proving that we cannot behave. Humans are not mature enough to handle the internet. I think that the idea of a free press and the right to criticize government, which is really what this came from, because people were not allowed to speak out against the king when the notion of the First Amendment was developed. It's been dysfunctionalized, if that's a word, where now this is a gigantic sewage pipe where huge, enormous amounts of information can come and cause enormous damage to people, which is completely unchecked. So in a certain sense, I feel we need some kind of management of the process. I don't know that it's government, but I will say this, and this is something Yasha Mauk, who's an intellectual who's in the film, and I have discussed at length, which is, in the past we had gatekeepers. A newspaper might run something stupid, but at least you knew that there were some people with a brain trying to filter out what goes on the air, goes into the paper. The internet is just a complete free-for-all, and you can completely create these huge factions and use these mechanisms of Facebook and what have you to legitimize, because it's on Facebook. You have the Facebook brand. You could almost write, according to Facebook, Jews created coronavirus. The Facebook gives it an imprimatur of legitimacy. So I think that corporations should have a much higher standard of policing hate speech on the internet, policing anti-Semitism on the internet, than the internet itself. I don't think that, for the government to say you can't say something anti-Semitic on the internet is kind of bizarre to me. But Facebook can say it, and Twitter can say it, and Instagram can say it, but they don't. They do close to nothing. If they wanted to stop it, they could stop it. They have this cozy relationship with the administration, and it goes on. But Europe scares me. I'm scared in Europe to say something. They could find me, or I don't even know. And I think that what Europe does is problematic. Europe has a different history than we do. Europe killed 6 million Jews.
Exactly. Let's go back to the film. You have a range of guests, from former President Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of United Kingdom, to subject matter experts, to the survivors of violence themselves, which frankly is quite poignant, particularly when you go through the story of what happened in the kosher supermarket in Paris. And you also had Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, who has made over the years some outrageous anti-Semitic comments. How did you decide to assemble this group of guests?
we did too much of it on the fly that I'm comfortable with. I mean, normally you like to have some sense of who you want to interview. The trouble is that, you say, well, we want to get a political leader. We want to get high level political leaders. I mean, it took me 6 months to get Clinton to agree. So, you never even know if you're going to get him. You cast a wide net. A lot of people say no. For us, almost everybody said yes. We had an important subject. We had a good platform and all of the above. But it's a balance. I mean, there's plenty of people we interviewed who didn't make it into the film. There are plenty of people who we thought we would have in the film much, much more, and we had them much less than we did. And it's sort of a mix of minds that come to the table, and we say, who should we get? You need experts, because otherwise it just becomes what we might call a follow documentary, where you follow a story. Following a story isn't going to educate people enough about the bigger issue. Experts are going to bore people. Celebrity type faces and names are usually good speakers. They move the needle. They drive press and attention. So you want to find a balance of all these things to make a film that somebody wants to watch, that somebody will watch to the end, that somebody will learn something from, and that someone will be emotionally moved by. Those are several different beats that a movie needs to accomplish. And if you fail on any one of those, it's going to lower the impact of your film and the reach of your film. And so that's kind of how we come up with that. If there's anybody in specific you want to ask me about, I'm happy to tell you.
Yeah, well, one of the on-camera guests I thought was quite interesting, because it's a cousin of yours who was a young Labor Party activist, and you kind of used that relationship as the portal to tell the story of how the Labor Party in England and its anti-Semitism became so disturbing. Tell us about that. You chose really, I think, a good subject, because so many Jews, like your cousin, in the UK were backers of the Labour Party, were active in the Labour Party. The Labour Party had at one point a close relationship with the state of Israel. Tell us about that choice and how it expanded into the full story of Jeremy Corbyn.
So I knew that we had family in England. My family came through England, and my grandmother was born in London, and we just don't know them very well, except for the older generations. And I thought, I had family in France, in Paris as well, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go to each country and talk to my family. And I don't have any family in Hungary, but the France thing didn't sort of go anywhere. He was from England. And I thought, well, I'll just chat with my, people in England and just see what they think. And I got on the phone with this cousin of mine, Paul, and I had not spoken to him or even knew that he existed. I had to call my one relative that I knew who lived in Paris, the only relative that I knew at all in that part of the world. I'd met someone once 30 years ago. And he said, oh, you should talk to this cousin. And I called, and nothing, nobody was interesting. And then I got on the phone with him, and he was like, let me tell you about Jeremy Corbyn. And I thought, this guy's right from Central Casting. I looked on his Facebook page, and there was a picture of him being lifted up by an elephant's, trunk. I thought, he's a character. But when I meet him on camera, that's literally the first time I met him. And I think that he's very emblematic of how most even Jews felt in that country. They felt as if their party had abandoned them. You talk to American Democrats, Jews, many, some, I don't know, I'm not going to put a number on it, who feel the Democratic Party has abandoned them. Historically, Jews have voted overwhelmingly for Democratic parties in the United States. And now there are many who don't feel like they have anywhere to go, because they're repulsed by the party, by the right wing, by the Republicans, and they feel that the left wing has turned on them. And that's the same case in particular with regard to Israel. They feel that it's turned on them, and that its criticism of Israel has gone well beyond criticism of Israel and become just overtly anti-Semitic, which it has in many cases, and in England in much more extreme cases. When my cousin tells me he ripped up his Labour Party card, I thought, this guy, I couldn't have written a script for him that was better. But he's not special. Jews all over England did that. It was like, it's the thing to do. It was almost trendy. People were so repulsed by what the Labour Party had said. Sure.
Islamic radicalism. That's part of the perfect storm. Anti-Semitism from the left, anti-Semitism from the right, Islamic radicalism. And it could be, as a mutation, it probably could be its own documentary, as far as it being a dangerous threat for centuries, and especially for Israel. How did you decide on this particular subject? And what more did you research that you could have put into that particular mutation?
Well, first of all, I hope you don't hear my daughter in the other room crying. I apologize if that's coming through. But
So we're living in the age of Zoomcasts, so
right,
not to
right.
worry.
So let me contextualize something. We call it Islamic radicalism in the film. I think that we could have chosen a better name. The statistics show that huge numbers of people, both in the Middle East, who are people that I would say of Muslim origin, right? Let's clarify that. They may not identify as practicing Muslims. They may not be practicing Muslims. They might identify as Muslim but not practice. They might be I don't want to use the word orthodox, but the extreme commitment to observance. Any level along that, we see much higher levels of anti-Semitism than we do in traditional Europe. Old school. I'm thinking, non-immigrant white. Blood and soil Europe, right? The idea that we come from this long line of white Christian Europeans. That community, while historically very anti-Semitic, the white Christian European community that has been there for centuries, they score lower on anti-Semitic tests today than Muslims do in that region and in the Middle East. Now, those are not radical Muslims. Many of the people that kill or are violent toward Jews in France are not radicalized. They're not Islamists, so to speak. We describe it that way in the film because we were talking in particular about a case of two men who did once swore allegiance to ISIS, etc. But there are bullies in schools. People are taking their children out of schools. People are getting beaten up without even the issue of radicalism ever coming into play. People have been robbed, all for being Jewish, committed by a person of Muslim origin, but not an Islamic radical. So we say, more accurately, people of Muslim origin is where this exists in France, and it's led to enormously violent consequences. We know from studies that the more religious people identify as, the higher the statistics in France are showing them to hold anti-Semitic views according to a survey. Now, surveys are about as good as the paper that they're on, but they might indicate something. You could do a whole film on it. Years ago, I did a film on anti-Semitism in the Middle East, and David Ignatius of the Washington Post described anti-Semitism in the Middle East as like the elevator music of the region. It's there. It's always been there. It doesn't seem to be getting better, and if anything, it seems to be getting worse.
I just wanted one more question about Europe before we talk about takeaways from the film. Since anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred, in Europe, it's just, again, centuries and centuries. We feel that Europe has to reckon with its long and ugly past, and invest in talking about the underlying causes of anti-Semitism in Europe, or we'll continue to see this continue. Hungary, which you've chosen, is one example, but this is a Europe-wide problem. To a greater extent in some places, to a lesser extent in some places, but certainly, as we both know, and as all of the viewers know, between 1933 and 1945, it was, of course, the worst moment in a long series of moments regarding anti-Semitism. Worst moment, worst time. What do you think about that? I mean, how do we turn this around? I mean, we're talking about the phenomenon. We're talking about the problem. You have highlighted, because that's the only way to do it in the time that's allotted to you, or that you are allotting to yourself to tell the story. But what do you think needs to be done to start turning this around?
Listen, I am not an activist or a social. I'm not I don't know how to solve problems. It's not. I mean, I might have my ideas. I'm certainly no professional on what Europe should do. The biggest mute button that was ever placed on Europe was when the Holocaust happened, right? Because after the Holocaust, we saw huge numbers of laws that were passed, behavior change, legislation, reparations, and suddenly Europe was on good behavior, right? Don't insult a Jew right now. It's in bad taste. No one was better behaved in the years after the Holocaust, maybe not immediately after the Holocaust, but in the arc of the years after the Holocaust. In Germany passed anti-Nazi legislation. They gave money to this group and to that group. They didn't get it right all the time. They got it wrong maybe more than half the time, but at least they did something. And now we see anti-Semitism emerging again in Germany. So first of all, I feel like Europe has a permanent problem with Jews. I'm not sure if that's something that we can ever eradicate. But I do think that this ties into an age-old ideology, a series of ideologies that was perpetuated by the church, that the Jews were the killer of Jesus. And I don't know that you can erase that. You know, people keep saying the Nazis was not under the Nazis had nothing to do with Christianity. You can draw a straight line from interpretations of and how Jews are perceived in the church right to Hitler. Hitler was not a particularly Christian guy at all, and neither was the Nazi Party, so to speak. Yet church attendance during the Holocaust in Germany was up. So we can't say this, the phenomena was that they were just this secular nation. But now we see this coming back again. And I don't know that education is always going to do it, because people all over France have been taught about the Holocaust. And yet you see the success of someone like Marine Le Pen, who espouses these anti-Semitic views, and the leadership of both the father and the daughter, who are both Le Pens, who both have run for political office, has grown. Right, you see elections for a man like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who regularly spews anti-Semitic ideas. His support has grown, and you see this all over Europe. It comes back. So I don't know that education always stops it. You mentioned takeaways from the film. The biggest takeaway I got was that I have increasingly or decreasingly less belief in humanity's desire to do good. The film left me with a very pessimistic outlook. I wish I could be more optimistic. I mean, people always want to end these sort of speeches with, we can do it and we're going to get to the next step. And I don't believe that. I wouldn't bet on it. And that's a sad state of affairs.
Well, that's your takeaway. Now, what would you like the audience to take away?
If we have any chance to improve as a species, we simply have to take action. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. But we cannot take any action to improve humanity if we don't know what we're dealing with. And so I am a believer as a journalist, as I've always been, which is that an informed population and an informed populace is the best tool to take the next step forward. So in a sense, I'm an educator, right? My mother was a school teacher. My wife is a school teacher. My father was a university professor at times. Big educator community I come from, and I want people to learn and to know. The ignorance about anti-Semitism, even amongst the learned, people who in the Jewish community or people who studied, is very, very low. They tend to know a very narrow part of it, and they tend to have made up all their opinions about it, and they don't want to hear anything else.
Andrew, one more question.
Sure.
What are your plans? What's the next project?
Years ago, I pitched a show to PBS called Cats Are People Too, about cats. And I got a letter from the programming director there. She said, Andrew, wait, no murder, no violence, no bloodshed. What is this, a nice show about cats? Because I thought cats would be a fun show. So I have two shows that I'm working on right now. One is I want to do a show about today's racism. Being a white man, I'm probably the least interesting person to do a show like this. But what I want to do is hold up a mirror to my own community of people who have traditionally not been the targets of the bigotries and racisms of today. Yes, I'm Jewish, but I'm speaking more about I don't like the phrase white privilege, but ultimately that's really what it comes down to, how it's infrastructurally baked into white perceptions and power perceptions. You look at, for example, the board of directors of a giant company, many of these companies, it'll be, let's say 40 people, or senior management, it'll be 40 people on a big email, on a big website. 37 will be white, and there will be one person of color who will be in charge of human resources. It's a structural problem that requires people look in a mirror and see what they can do better. The other project I'm working on is one about animal cruelty. So I'm sort of like the Bad News Bears of documentary filmmaking. I'm also working on a reality show about cooking. So that should be fun. Smiles and
well, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. The documentary is viral, Anti-Semitism in 4 Mutations, now available on Amazon Prime. Special thanks to Andrew Goldberg for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in to One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International. If you like what you hear, make sure you never miss a show by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn about our work. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For my guest, Andrew Goldberg, I'm Dan Mariaschin. We'll see you next time on One-on-One with B'nai B'rith International.